Hello, everyone. My name is Donna Tam. I'm the executive editor of Marketplace here, and I'm super excited to welcome you all here to this webinar. Before we get started, just want to say thank you so much for being an investor. If you've been following the news lately and know a bit about where we're located, a lot of our staff is dealing with the LA fires right now. And so every kind of support that we get is so meaningful. And we feel it every day with our audience behind us. So I really appreciate all of you for supporting Marketplace. We also, have a lot of support from different organizations, and this particular webinar is funded in part by a grant from the Peter PG Foundation. I'm sorry, Peter G. Peterson Foundation. Apologies. And so also want to thank them for their generous support of our national debt reporting. So we received a ton of great pre-submitted questions from you all. It really goes to show just how wonderful our investors are, how much you all invest in our content, and we really appreciate that. So our panelists will get started with some of those questions, but there's also a Q&A box that you can open up and write in other questions as we go, and we'll share some of those as well. And also feel free to open up the chat and say hello, share where you're from. Jeffrey Marasini definitely did this. He's from Troy, Michigan. So we appreciate when you guys do that, just letting us all know where everyone is coming from. And we really appreciate your time. So I'm going to start off here by introducing our moderator, Amir Bibaw. Sorry, Amir Bibawy, who is our managing editor. So Amir is going to kick it off and have a great conversation with Kimberly Adams and Nancy Marshall-Genzer, both stars of our DC bureau. Amir, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Donna, and thanks for everyone for joining us and for being an investor in Marketplace. And as Donna said, obviously our thoughts are with everyone near LA who's battling a very unfortunate and tragic situation. So very excited about this conversation. I know we're going to have a very lively engagement and conversation between me and our reporters, and also with all of you attending. So let's get started. First, let's just put a number on it. How much is the U.S. national debt today?
About $36 trillion. And basically, we have had deficits since 2001. Every year we have to borrow to make up for the shortfall. We don't have enough money to pay all our bills, essentially. And that adds up every year to now $36 trillion.
And to put that, Kimberly, go ahead. You were saying something.
I was going to say, years ago, I did a story trying to explain the difference between the national debt and the deficit, right? And the way that I illustrated it, thanks to a very helpful economist who described it to me this way, is I started filling a bathtub with water, right? And the water going in was the amount that we overspend on our federal budget every year. And the overall level of water in the tub was the national debt. And so we're constantly putting extra money onto that number, when we overspend every year because, we like to spend money and not necessarily raise taxes, because who likes to raise taxes, which we can get to later. We're just overspending every year. We're adding to that debt level. And then when you count interest that we pay on the debt, that makes that level go up even higher.
And there's something called the debt to GDP ratio, which is basically comparing how much we owe to how much the economy produces. And for 2024, it's almost 100%, which means our debt is about equal to how much our economy produces, which is a little bit crazy to me. Now, the Wharton School at Penn has come up with an estimate that our debt could actually get up to 200% of GDP before it's unsustainable. So, we've got a little wiggle room, I guess, but I don't think we really want to get up to 200% of GDP.
Great, and that was a lot of numbers, a lot of information in one go, but it sets the stage for our conversation. But we talked about the national debt and the debt ceiling. There's and the deficit. There's a third D in this conversation, which is the debt ceiling only comes up every so often in our coverage. and in the national conversation, national debate. Why do we have a debt ceiling?
I'll let you take that one, Nancy.
Nancy, go for it. You're the expert.
Of the developed nations, only us and Denmark have debt ceilings.
That's right.
Excuse me. And Denmark doesn't have any problem raising its debt ceiling. We obviously do. It wasn't always that way. Didn't used to be a big deal. The debt ceiling started with World War I and around 1917. It used to be that the president had to go to Congress every time, Treasury had to go to Congress every time it wanted to spend a large amount of money, get permission, spend the money. Then when it needed to borrow again, it had to go back to Congress, get permission. So in 1917, Congress said, okay, you can go ahead and borrow, but only up to this limit. You can sell war bonds for the war, but only up to this limit. And generally after that, the limit was raised without much debate. But gosh, over the past 20 years or so, it's gotten to be such a political mess. And Congress has stopped actually raising the limit, and it started just suspending it and saying, okay, as of, in this case, January 1st, 2025, the debt limit's going to snap back into place.
You know, Patricia Thomas asks in the chat, if Japan can run a deficit of X%, why can't the US?
Yes.
And Japan, thank you to our intern Jack in our DC bureau who pulled these numbers for us. Japan has a debt to GDP ratio of something like 255%, right?
Yep.
And Japan is functioning, right? And everybody wants to go there on vacation now, apparently. But it's been a break on their economic growth, right? And this is still an issue for them having this debt. But the real reason why Japan can run that kind of debt to GDP ratio and we can't is because of our politicians, right? We as a country have decided via the people that we elect that debt is a problem. And we don't want to have this kind of debt. We don't want to be paying this much of our national budget on interest on the debt, that we don't like the fact that government bonds and people getting high interest on government bonds might crowd out other investment. It's really about the political decisions we make as a country.
It's great that we're talking about Japan because, if you've been a business journalist or editor for a long time, Japan was always cited as sort of in the G7, which are Japan, Canada, Germany, the US, Britain, France, Italy. It's always been the country that was cited as, well, look at Japan. They're very indebted. It's going to be a problem. And in reality, Japan is a very particular country and has what we often talk about is, an aging workforce, very little immigration, etc. And so they're a very particular case. They are the most indebted in terms of debt to GDP ratio among the G7 countries. The US is kind of at the half point, really. There's 3 that are worse off and 3 better off. And I'll come back to that in a second because I have a chart on my screen that illustrates something very interesting. But, Kimberly, you brought up a very interesting point, which is debt and the sort of, I want to move from that to sort of the meaning of debt, because no one likes to be in debt, right? It's not a particularly happy thing. However, much of the US economy is actually built on debt, whether it's mortgages, student loans, car loans, personal loans, and I just want to bring us to talk a little bit about why not all government debt is bad.
Right. We use debt. When I say we, I mean the United States, our government. We use debt to do things that we have prioritized as a country via our elected officials. So, for example, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which I'm sure will come up again. People in our government said it was a priority to bring in less revenue to the federal government to direct more money into the broader economy, which they thought was going to help growth. There's debates and didn't really seem to work as well as they thought it did, but that was a priority. So we decreased revenue, increased debt as a result because that was a priority. The Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill passed under the Biden administration, right? We finance these initiatives a lot of times with debt because we have decided as a country that spending money, even if it costs us money at the front end, is going to help our economic growth in the long term. That if we have a more climate resilient country, if we have better infrastructure, that is going to improve GDP growth overall. And that in itself is a good enough reason for us to carry the debt. Additionally, it gets back to sort of who's holding that debt. Most of our national debt, the vast majority of our national debt, is held by other Americans. It's the bonds sitting in your retirement account. It's the underlying mechanisms of your pension fund. Yes, some of it is held by foreign countries, but that's a declining amount over time, and it's definitely not the majority. So is it a terrible thing that, I mentioned earlier, that we're paying so much interest on the national debt. And you'll hear this talking point over and over again. We spend more on interest on the national debt than we spend on the military, healthcare, and education combined. Sure, we do. But that interest is paid out to Americans who hold those bonds, which yields higher interest rates for the people maybe who want to pull that money out in retirement. So is that a good or a bad thing? That's the decisions that we get to make as a country.
And if you're curious about the foreign countries that hold the most debt, our biggest creditors are Japan, followed by China and Britain. But again, as Kimberly said, the majority of our debt is held by Americans.
I want to just to briefly mention also when the pandemic hit, for example, and interest rates were super low. A lot of economists, a lot of people in the press, and op-ed writers across the board were saying this is the moment, in fact, to borrow money to spend on all these projects, right? To upgrade the infrastructure, to deal with COVID, issues that were hitting the economy. And if either one of you can just bring us up to speed, and I don't want to make this in any way politicized. So let's talk about the last 20 years, right, where there have been Democratic and Republican administrations. In those 20 years, do we know how much acceleration in accumulating this debt has happened?
Well, I can say we had a surplus in 2001. Then, of course, we had the 9/11 attacks during the administration of George W. Bush, and the deficit increased exponentially. I think it might have been 125% of GDP. It's about 100% today. And that was because, we had wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then we had Obama during the financial crisis. He also increased the deficit, not as much as George W. Bush did, but he also increased the deficit in an effort to cushion the blow from the financial crisis. I will say during President-elect Donald Trump's first term, he increased the deficit the most percentage-wise in one term of any president, but he had the pandemic to deal with. Biden also increased the deficit, but he also had the pandemic to deal with. Now, some people have said that the Democrats went too far in passing the Inflation Reduction Act toward the beginning of Biden's term. We had more payments sent out to most families. About 90% of American families got $1,400 pandemic relief payments. Some people say that wasn't necessary. But this is what the government does in times of crisis. It ratchets up the debt to help us out of the crisis, help the economy through a crisis.
Yeah, and I'll point to the language that Nancy's using here because it's important. She's talking about each of these presidents adding to the deficit, which if you'll remember is sort of that annual amount that's going in over what we bring in revenues and therefore adding to the debt. So as these administrations, one after the other, keep adding to the deficit, that debt number keeps getting exponentially bigger because in addition to them just adding to the debt with those annual deficit numbers, there's interest on that debt, right? And so it's becoming more of a political talking point issue because the numbers are just getting so much bigger because it's accumulating over time.
Is it possible for us to say that the U.S. is such an economic superpower because we have taken on so much debt and spent it on various economic endeavors?
I think maybe to some extent, but I will say I think there's good debt and bad debt.
Right.
I mean, we have some programs. I'm thinking of the F-35 fighter jet that's produced by Lockheed Martin, and it has so many problems. It's always down for maintenance. Its guns, there are problems with the accuracy of its guns, but Lockheed Martin was very smart and spread out the production of the F-35. So there is the F-35 is produced all over the country, and it touches every congressional district. So what member of Congress is going to want to cut funding for the F-35 and possibly cut jobs in their district? They're just not going to do it. So that's an example of, wasteful spending. I will say we also have a tremendous advantage in that so many transactions are done in the dollar. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. So if you have a country like, say, South Africa that's borrowing in dollars and the South African rand loses value against the dollar, they're having to pay more to borrow the same amount in dollars. We don't have that problem, and that's a tremendous advantage.
And if I can add to what Nancy was just saying about the power of the dollar as a global reserve currency, let's do a little mental exercise. If the United States decided that our debt is such a huge problem, we don't want to have any more debt. And so we stop issuing so many bonds into the global market, right? Well, then you don't have so many countries needing to do their business in dollars if they're not keeping dollars as their reserve currency. Because when we say dollars are the reserve currency, that's because they've got a bunch of treasury bonds sitting in their domestic bank accounts holding American debt as their backup because they know they can always go to America and get that money back. So us distributing our debt throughout the global economy also is a type of leverage. It's a type of political power.
I want to first thank a lot of the attendees, a lot of the investors on the Zoom right now, because so much is coming on in the chat that is informative even to me, and I want to take a thread from there. Ethan Abelman, I'm not sure where he is, but is saying let's not attribute the debt decisions to presidents, because it's ultimately Congress that actually makes the decision, right? And I want to bring in you veteran Washington reporters gearing up or already geared up for a new Congress, right? That was just sworn in about 11 days ago. That is set to coincide with the new administration, with President Trump coming back into office. You just give us a little bit of where we stand on this, and I'm going to pivot from this to sort of the political volleyball of the national debt. But let's talk first about who's coming in and what they think about the national debt.
So
go ahead.
You go ahead first, Nancy, please.
Well, I was going to say there are a lot of hawks who, on the Republican side, who really do not want to increase the debt. I mean, some of them say, I have never voted to increase the debt ceiling ever. So you're going to have these factions who are really against deficit spending and debt. And we've got a number of deadlines coming up. The continuing resolution that's funding the government right now expires on March 14th. The latest debt ceiling suspension expired January 1st. We haven't actually hit it yet, but we're expected to between tomorrow and January 23rd. The Treasury Department can continue with what it calls extraordinary measures, kind of looking for change in the couch cushions to keep us going till June or July. But after that, we really will have to raise the debt limit or suspend the debt limit. So there are a whole lot of deadlines coming up, and a fair number, mainly Republicans, who really do not want to raise the debt ceiling or suspend the debt ceiling and don't want to spend more. So there are a lot of competing forces at work.
Speaking of competing forces, Ethan Abelman raises something that we've both been talking about a lot, Nancy. He says, Yet the hawks are all going to vote to extend the TCJA, yes, which is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the 2017 law that cut taxes for most Americans, whether people want to believe it or not, it did. But it also was a major contributor to the deficits in the national debt. And yes, the data that we have says that those tax cuts skewed to benefit wealthier Americans more, but still most people got some kind of tax cut. I didn't, but whatevs. But Republicans have said they definitely want to extend many provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which, according to estimates from the Congressional Budget Office, could add something like $4 trillion to the deficit. And I was actually talking about this for a story that I was doing about the CBO and how it calculates these numbers for a story I was working on for the Marketplace show. And I think we have a clip of it. And I spoke to Chris Towner from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And he was talking about why Chris Towner, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, was talking about why what happens with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act matters for the American people, especially when it comes to the debt.
Every American should care about the national debt. We're talking about equaling roughly the size of the economy. And, by the end of the decade, we're talking about hitting a new record as a share of the economy. So if we add another $4 trillion to it, the current debt projections are that at the end of the decade, we'll be at 125% of the economy.
So, Nancy was talking earlier about, being in projections to get to 200% of the economy before we become unsustainable. Just this one thing, if extended the way that they're talking about, could jump us to 125, right? And so you have differing competing groups among the Republicans in Congress about how to handle this. So just this past week, Republicans from blue states like California, New York, what they call the SALT caucus, were down at Mar-a-Lago petitioning President-elect Trump, saying that as part of this deal, they want to boost back up the deduction for state and local taxes, which got knocked down to 10 grand in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. They want it boosted anywhere to $100,000 to eliminate it altogether. That, again, would add to the debt. And how are they talking about paying for extending that tax benefit, as well as maybe continuing the pass-through deductions for certain kinds of businesses, which is also very expensive, cutting things like food stamps or SNAP benefits, putting more work requirements and eligibility requirements on Medicaid, potentially restricting some parts of Medicare. The money has to come from somewhere if you agree with the budget hawks among the Republican Party. And so these are going to be real competing forces that we're going to see play out in fights within the Republican Party in this coming Congress to see what they do with that.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Amir.
Go ahead. No, go.
Well, I was just going to say, I took a look at the questions that everyone sent in. Thank you for sending those. And a lot of people are wondering, we've had a surplus in the past. Could we do it again? Why couldn't we just do what George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton did back in the 90s? And this might be a little depressing, but it appears that might not be repeatable. And I asked somebody about that.
And hold on, Nancy, hold on for a second. Yep. Just to explain, the surplus would be a budget surplus, not that we would eliminate our national debt, right?
Yeah,
just
budget surplus.
Like an annual budget surplus, like in the Clinton years based on H.W. Bush and Clinton.
Yeah. So basically, we had enough money to pay our bills in that particular year, and we had a little extra. So, this happened from 1997 to 2001. We still had a debt of about $6 trillion, but we didn't have a deficit every year. We actually had a surplus. We had a little extra money left over after we paid our bills each year. So the question is, why couldn't we do that again? And I asked Philip Joyce that question. He's a professor of public policy at the University of Maryland. He says he gets asked that question all the time. I asked him, and I have some tape on this.
And I have people ask me all the time, why don't we just do that again? Well, that I think is not very replicable. right? I mean, that involves, having a big temporary increase in revenues, fine, cutting the defense budget, and having people agree to tax increases.
So just to back up a little bit, George H.W. Bush really set the scene for President Clinton coming in, because in the early 90s, George H.W. Bush went back on his pledge of no new taxes and actually signed an agreement, a bipartisan agreement to raise taxes and cut spending. And so that really paved the way for later in the 90s for the surpluses that we had. And then in 1993, President Clinton and the Democrats hiked taxes again. And then we had the dot-com bubble in the late 90s. So we had a higher tax rate. People were paying more in taxes on their gains in the stock market. And then the Clinton administration slashed the Defense Department because they had what they called a peace dividend. They thought everybody was going to hug and sing Kumbaya because the Berlin Wall fell. Russia was trying to become a democracy. So they had tremendous cuts in the Defense Department. They had higher tax rates, and the baby boomers had not started to retire. So there really was not a lot of stress on Social Security. We really don't have the same situation now at all. We have a dangerous world, the war in Ukraine, China saying things about Taiwan. Nobody wants to cut the defense budget. That's not going to happen. Congress is talking about cutting taxes, not raising them. There's not the will to raise taxes. And of course, baby boomers are retiring in droves. And so there's a real strain on Social Security. So that's why at least that blueprint from the 90s is not going to be replicated now. Unfortunately. Sorry.
Okay. Well, I want to touch on a point that one of our investors put in the chat. Peter Scaturu was saying, at which is there going to be a tipping point where we are so indebted as a nation that our debt is actually less attractive, if not at all attractive, to the world?
I would say it's that 200% when debt gets to be 200% of GDP. And also, you get to the point, if you're at 200% of GDP, the government may simply not be able to make the interest rate payments.
How much is the interest rate payment now of our federal budget?
It's one of the three biggest components of our budget, along with, mandatory spending on things like Social Security and Medicare. Interest on the debt is the third biggest thing that we're spending on right now. So it's a huge part of the budget.
I want to say it's like, what, 13%, Nancy?
Right, something.
That sounds about right.
13. Yeah. Do you think people, Congress people are actually aware of this tipping point? And kind of, in your reporting, does it ever come up?
So it comes up quite a bit in my reporting, and I would have a slightly different answer than Nancy. I don't think it's going to be that 200% number. I think it's when we stop paying, right? Because as long as this is why the debt ceiling debate, especially this last one, where it really looked like we might default and the markets actually started pricing that in, that's when people start freaking out, when it looks like the United States government will no longer keep paying its obligations, right? Because right now, the thing that makes us the reserve currency, that makes us the currency that everybody wants to do their business in, that makes us ideal for the safest of safest pension funds and retirement accounts, is that the United States government has always paid its bills. Even when we're broke, even when we're running deficits and debt and whatever, we will literally go into austerity measures before we stop paying our bondholders. And the whole world knows that. And the moment that stops, that's when there's, as somebody asked in the Q&A, a run on our debt. And that's when it stops being attractive. And we saw that in the bond market the last time the debt ceiling really came up for debate, because people were genuinely concerned. The markets, economists were genuinely concerned that Congress was I should say specifically the Republicans in Congress, were digging their heels in so hard that they were not going to raise that debt limit. People believed it, and the bond market started pricing that in, and US debt became less attractive. So I think that that could happen way before we hit that 200% number. It happens the moment we stop paying.
And
I think,
our credit rating was decreased again just last August from AAA to AA plus. So that means we pay more to borrow.
I'm cynical on that because these are the same credit rating agencies that price the mortgage-backed securities just fine. So
yeah, we all remember, however, in 2011 with the debt ceiling crisis back then, and I was reporting on it in Congress. The downgrade that came even after the agreement was a big deal.
Yes.
It was a big deal.
Yes.
I'm going to move to the questions that are being submitted right now, but I did want to touch upon one thing that I know is going to come up for sure in the Q&A is sort of the economic elephant in the reporting and journalism room, modern monetary theory. I feel like, it has a lot of credibility, especially among certain members of Congress and, economists as well. And I feel like in the financial press and, in journalism in general, covering business and government, it gets short shrift. And I know a lot of people are interested in it. Can one of you tell us what it is first, or what its theory about national debt is, and whether it's attractive or not, or what are the pros and cons?
Yeah, I mean, modern monetary theory basically says the U.S. government can print money, so why worry about the debt? You can just print more money. I mean, the Fed basically did that during the pandemic. It flooded the market with cash by buying up U.S. treasuries and other debt. So the Fed has kind of done that. What I worry about with modern monetary theory is that could lead to inflation. If you're just printing money and the government increases its spending, that could drive up inflation. And so that is my main concern about it.
I mean, this is kind of everyone's concern about modern monetary theory. And I've asked a couple of members of the Federal Reserve Board about it. I remember during the pandemic asking, I forget which one, but it was one of the members of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, like what he thought of modern monetary theory. And he's like, we're about to find out. Like, we are literally in the midst of an experiment of what it means. And I don't think we have a clear answer, because the sort of critics of modern monetary theory said you can't just engage in this endless spending, even if it stimulates the economy, because the inflation costs are too high, right? But there's disagreement right now over whether the inflation coming out of the pandemic was actually caused by that influx of federal spending, or was it caused by corporate greed and price gouging or supply chain shocks? Was it the spending or was it something else? And we're still getting research and data about what's happened in the last 5 years to fully understand the effects of that influx of federal spending from the Pandemic Relief Act and the CARES Act and all of those things. So the jury's still out. I mean, we should have Stephanie Kelton back on, who promoted this theory, and see how she's feeling.
I want to encourage all the investors on the call to submit their questions. We're going to get to them just after one more question from me, and I'm sure our listeners know that we pride ourselves on making business and economics accessible to the layman, to the listener, to the person who is not really, doesn't know much about finance or is intimidated by the world of, stocks and bonds and all these things, and why these things matter to them in their daily lives. And I want to just wrap up this section of this segment of the Zoom with, for Joe or Jane, a citizen in America who's not involved in government or economics or business in any way, why should they be concerned about, or should they be concerned about the national debt to start with?
I think they should. I mean, I have twin boys, 15-year-old boys, and I think about what we're passing on to them. So we're racking up debt now that our kids and our grandkids will have to pay off. But you can also look at the effects on the economy. So when you have the Treasury Department issuing a lot of Treasury bonds to pay off debt, if it might be a matter of supply and demand, if Treasury is auctioning off a lot more Treasury bonds, you may not have as much demand, or investors may say, hey, you want me to invest in you, you're going to have to pay me a higher interest rate. And Treasury bonds are generally seen as more attractive than corporate debt. So if Treasuries are paying a higher interest rate, corporate debt gets a little bit less interesting. So corporations can't raise money. Private investment is sort of crowded out by all of the borrowing from the Treasury Department. And then what happens is stock prices can fall. If companies can't borrow and grow, their stock prices fall. So if you have money in the stock market, you're certainly going to be affected by that.
Even if you don't have money in sort of the individual corporate stocks in the stock market, if you have a retirement account or a mutual fund or an index fund, you probably hold treasury bonds. And so the rate of interest that the federal government is paying to service its debt literally translates into how much money you have for retirement. Now, that matters on sort of one side of the ledger. You kind of want the government to be paying higher interest rates for that because that's more money for you in your retirement account. Congratulations. But on the other side of it, let's look at something specifically like Social Security or even Medicare. Despite modern monetary theory, because it is a theory that people talk about right now, most of our political leaders believe that debt is a bad thing, right? And that debt is a problem and that we should have less of it. And most of Americans think that too. When you hear about debt, people talk about it as a bad thing because most of us don't necessarily embrace or understand modern monetary theory. Fine. Okay. If that is the case, then that means it's going to be part of our political discourse what to do about the debt for the foreseeable future. And many political leaders only know of two strategies for addressing debt and deficit. You cut programs, you cut spending, or you raise taxes. Both of those affect Americans every day, whether it be less money for education, less money for environmental programs, less money for food safety inspections, or the biggest drains on our federal spending are defense spending. Are we going to cut back on our military spending and, as some people would see it, our preparedness for dealing with global conflicts? Are we going to reduce benefits for aging Americans? Right now, Social Security is set to run out of its reserve savings sometime around 2035. If that happens without congressional action, you're going to see a cut to benefits, something like 17% less. No, Social Security is not going to run out of money, despite what people say. It would just mean a cut to benefits. But people are going to feel that. And so that means that either they're going to have to lower the retirement age or reduce the number of benefits or types of benefits that people have, because the narrative will be, whether it's true or not, and that's going to be up to people to decide, because they're going to say we cannot afford to keep paying it, we have to do something.
And Fed Chair Jerome Powell has talked about this. He's been asked about the federal debt in press conferences, in the 60 Minutes interview he did last year. He said, the U.S. is on an unsustainable path because our debt is growing faster than our economy. So this is something that the Fed is keeping an eye on as well, watching for inflationary effects and trying to figure out how we can get on a more sustainable path.
I want to thank you both for your answer to this question, and it answers you veered into one of the questions that were submitted in the Q&A. Sorry, I was digging up a link. There is a question from, and we're going to go down to the Q&A. Thank you for bearing with us, and I hope this is all very informative for everyone attending. From Edward Silurso, I believe. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Is asking, how do the rates that the U.S. pays on its debt compare to Japan, Germany, England, etc.? And I will jump in actually to answer this, because I was we had a really great story which I'm going to drop in the chat by Sabrina Ashur that aired last week, about what is actually happening in the global bond market, the global government bond market, what you're finding is yields are going up and up over the past 2 weeks. You may have heard that there is a crisis in Britain about this in particular. What is happening actually is in places like Germany, the rates are actually lower than the U.S. rate, which is quite surprising. And usually the U.S. is, right there at the lowest, actually, just because people trust that the U.S. is going to pay back, trust the, political will behind paying back the interest on the debt, and, trust the American economy more than any economy in the world, probably. And so, if you're looking at the chat, you will see this link that I dropped. I think it's a very informative story that will just explain a little bit what is happening and why the US is not really at the top right now. Even within the EU, you would think that they have the same, the Euro countries have the same currency. Their debt yields on their debt are, very, very different from each other. You may find countries like Austria and the Netherlands have very low yields versus countries like Spain, Greece, Italy, etc. From Carrie Tanny, who asked about climate change, and I know Kimberly answered this question, and maybe Kimberly can elaborate a little bit. The question was with, and nodding, of course, to what's happening in California right now in terms of the fires. It seems like year after year, more severe weather events are happening, whether they are hurricanes or snowstorms or fires out west. And that obviously leads to a lot of spending by the government to help those communities to rebuild, etc. Is this going to be impacted, Kimberly, do you think, by the level of indebtedness and what is happening with the national debt? Our ability to cope with these events?
I absolutely think it is. We're already seeing this. We saw this in the last continuing resolution for a spending bill, because as we were chatting just before we hopped on, that we haven't actually had a properly funded government since something like the spring of 2023. And now we've been on continuing resolutions on our budget for some time now. But even in this last continuing resolution, Democrats wanted to add disaster spending to it to help people recover from hurricanes Helene and what was the other one down south, but the two big hurricanes that we had this summer. And it was a battle. It was a battle because some of the deficit hawks said, no, we can't keep passing additional spending without offsetting it with cuts elsewhere. And so we're going to continue to see the people who are very invested in lowering the deficit, lowering the debt, say that every amount of spending needs to be offset with something else. And disaster aid is just a growing pot of demand because the National Flood Insurance Program is constantly running out of money, right? Mm-hmm. And we don't even have a fire version of the National Flood Insurance Program to help people out in disasters like this. So it has to be individually approved packages of money for each of these disasters. The president will approve a national disaster declaration to release certain funds from HUD and from other agencies to help people out, but then often those run out from the Small Business Administration. That money will get spent down very quickly, and so Congress has to appropriate more. And every time it goes back to Congress, it's going to keep running into these same debates. Is it worth raising the debt? And as we continue to have more and more expensive disasters, and people are asking to rebuild in the same places where these disasters happen, I think it's going to be reasonable, especially for members of Congress maybe representing districts that don't have a lot of these natural disasters, to say, why are we paying for this?
The reality is, though, that the disasters are now so spread out, that it's actually not becoming so political, I guess, anymore, because, some Republican states, obviously, or red states, as they're called, are facing dangers from hurricanes on the East Coast. And, California, obviously, being a blue state on the West Coast, is having its own share, and Oregon and other states on the West Coast having their share of fires. And Nancy, did you want to add anything?
Well, yeah, we've had tornado warnings and had a tornado touch down in Maryland, where I am. But I was going to say, there's been talk with what's happening in California and the California State Fund for, the insurer of last resort for fire insurance possibly running out of money. There has been talk that, hey, maybe we need something like national flood insurance for fires, because otherwise, how can people rebuild if they can't get insurance? And the National Flood Insurance Program is become quite expensive with all the hurricanes and floods. So then are we going to add on to that? And what happens if we don't?
Just cognizant of the time, I'm going to move us a little bit into faster questions and faster responses, just everyone gets their share. Okay. Several people have brought this up, so I want you both to sort of put it to rest. The national debt and your personal wallet and personal credit card, the analogy that never goes away, that people are, very fond of saying, well, if the government is like, a household, why are they doing whatever? Take it away. Tell us.
We can't print our own money.
As individuals,
yes.
Right?
Exactly.
And I also can't say go to the global market or the market in general and say, hey, I'm a great person, you should give me unlimited amounts of money with no collateral on my good name. I can do that to some extent. I can get a credit card, I can get a loan, but I'm gonna max it out pretty quickly based on my income and based on my assets. The United States government is not that. We pretty much have an unlimited spending credit card with the global economy. People are willing to lend us as much money as we will borrow, effectively no strings attached, as long as we keep paying that interest.
We also have the Fed, which, remember during the pandemic, it just bought up all that debt the Treasury was issuing and flooded the economy with money. There's no Fed at my back saying, yeah, Nancy, go ahead and issue Marshall-Genzer bonds. We'll buy them up, no problem. Not going to happen.
Is there any, in your reporting, do you ever hear from anyone a serious sort of consideration of ever paying it down, the national debt?
Down to zero?
No, not to zero, but I mean, that's not exaggerate, but really reducing it as opposed to increasing it.
I think before you can actually start reducing it, you have to stop running a deficit. Remember, I was saying in 2001, even when we had a surplus, we still had the debt left over from all those years of deficit spending of about $6 trillion. So I think really before you can talk about paying down the debt, you have to stop having deficits every year, which just adds to it.
Yeah, I hear much more conversation about eliminating or reducing the deficits because they don't want to keep adding to the national debt than I hear about let's work on, reducing the national debt. Because I think that it just feels a little bit impossible until you solve that first problem.
And one thing that the debt to GDP ratio measures is how long it would take to pay off the national debt. So our debt to GDP ratio is about almost 100 right now, which means it would take 100 years to pay off our debt.
For what it's worth, Nancy, David Coons on the chat is willing to buy your bonds. So you may want to
yes, thank you, David.
The next round of Marketplace swag, Nancy Marshall-Genzer bonds.
Your own debt. Just making sure that everyone gets their questions in as we go along, because we're kind of hitting the 50-minute mark, and I don't want to keep people beyond what they were expecting. Interesting question from Stuart Greenfield. New question. Assuming that tariffs are imposed and our balance of trade is reduced, where will the savings come from to cover the deficit? It's a bit complicated. Kimberly, why don't you unpack this a little bit? Tariffs are imposed. We know the Trump administration is coming in with an intention to increase tariffs across the board. Balance of trade is reduced, meaning people import more from us than we import from them, right?
Yeah.
How will that impact the deficit?
So this is hard because we don't know that one thing necessarily follows another, right?
Yeah.
So it could be that the retaliatory tariffs are such that it skews that balance. It could be that people just can't get enough of their sheen and they keep buying it anyway. So we don't necessarily know that the balance of trade would be reduced by tariffs. Could, but let's just say for argument's sake that that happens, right? Okay, so we are then importing less than we are exporting to other countries, which means that more dollars are flooding into the global economy than not. I suppose that could make the dollar stronger, which could help us reduce the deficits a little bit. Amir, I actually feel like this is more in your wheelhouse than mine.
Well, it is true that the dollar could potentially strengthen, and just to sort of quantify this by the so many ifs that we've gone through. Right? If the tariffs are imposed, if the interesting thing I think about tariffs is, and I've had a discussion recently with a professor at Princeton, Professor Grossman, who is a world expert on tariffs. Over dinner, in fact, it was a random encounter in a public dinner, and I asked him very specifically all the questions that people ask about tariffs, and his take was, it's not very predictable actually, and it's not very clear that if we taxed, I don't know, Hoovers coming from China, that we would make more Hoovers automatically in America, or that they will cost less, or any of this. I feel it's a fairly complicated question.
And there can be exceptions to the tariffs. Kimberly, you and I were covering this back in 2017. The United States Trade Representative held hearings, and U.S. companies like shoe importers,
lined up
clothing
outside
importers,
of this building,
lined up and went to these hearings at the U.S. Trade Representative and begged, please, please, please make an exception for me.
Yeah, it's down the street from the Marketplace DC bureau.
Yes.
So we were like
and
going
we
down
sent our poor intern there to cover this day of hearings.
They were desperate. They were
hundreds of companies going in, pleading their case. Please don't make us pay tariffs to import our shoes from China. So that's another wrinkle that can really complicate things, because there were some pretty major exceptions to the Trump tariffs in his first administration.
Yeah.
And to clarify, the Biden administration kept all of those tariffs, and in fact increased, the tariffs in their own way, especially with EVs. So it's not really, while there's a lot of talk on the Trump administration side, both the outgoing and the incoming, it's not just a Republican. It's not just a Republican issue. A lot of questions about Social Security. Back and forth comments in the chat, and as we kind of come to the final part, I want us to touch on this. Is Social Security under threat? Is it going to be impacted?
Well, if you listen to the politicians, they all say that they will not touch it. But if you talk to economists, they say that is impossible if you actually want to do anything about the national deficit or debt, or to even keep it solvent. I was looking at some of the debate about whether Social Security is an entitlement or is it not? Is it a Ponzi scheme? Is it not? The people aging into Social Security now will receive more in value in benefits than they put into the system. I've done a bunch of reporting on this. You could have paid into Social Security your whole life, but if you live out your life expectation, if you hopefully you're healthy and you live a long life, if you live to be a ripe old age and you're pulling from Social Security that whole time, Social Security and Medicare, you will pull more out in benefits than you put in over the course of your economic life.
Mm-hmm.
And the younger people who are working are likely to put in more than they will receive in benefits than they are on the current trajectory that we are on, because it's running out of money, right?
Bringing Nancy's kids into this into the equation.
Yes, we're bringing Nancy's kids
all of
into
our kids,
it.
my kids, Nancy's, right? The younger generation in general, yes.
Yeah,
there are things that could be done. Some economists have said, look, maybe we can raise the retirement age, raise the age at which you receive full retirement benefits to maybe 68 instead of 67. Maybe you tax more of a person's earnings past $120,000 for Social Security. I mean,
and all these things have happened in our lifetime, right? I mean, it's not. I remember when the caps were raised, right? And other countries have raised the retirement ages, so it's not exactly politically impossible.
Well, this happened in the 1980s. 1983, I believe, is when there was the last time that Social Security the Social Security Trust Fund was about to run out of money. That's where they put the excess money from Social Security, and it was about to run down in 1983. And they did a bunch of things to make it solvent, and it was supposed to keep it solvent for 10 years or so, and then they were going to deal with it again. It actually lasted way longer than that. Good job. But some of the things they did, they can't do now. So, for example, they brought federal workers into the system and had them start contributing to Social Security. Well, they're already in the mix. They raised the retirement age, which there's not a lot of appetite to do now. They changed something else about the taxes, which I forget. So basically, a lot of the tools that were available back in the 80s to make that system solvent are no longer available to us. And in the 80s, they didn't have the stockpile of money built up that they were running down. So right now, we're not just overspending beyond what the system brings in. We're overspending beyond what the system brings in tax revenue, plus what we're pulling out of the savings account. So the gap between what is needed and what's coming in is even bigger than it was the last time we were headed for this kind of issue on Social Security. And so, I know that people are talking about, the money was worth more when I put it in than it is now. Even so, and I've asked a bunch of economists about this, even if the value of the dollar was higher when you were putting into the system than you're pulling out, you're still going to likely pull out more in benefits than you put in. Just because healthcare is more expensive now, food is more expensive now, everything is more expensive now. And for a variety of calculations in the way that you run it, the people, you did not, if you're taking out Social Security in the next decade or so, you're going to pull more out of the system than you put into it, which is the way that the system was designed to work. But it was designed with the assumption that we were going to have a workforce roughly equivalent to the retiring groups. And our workforce is shrinking. I'll add the little side tangent very quickly that we have a lot of undocumented immigrants who are paying into Social Security with their labor and their taxes, but will never get it because they're undocumented and unauthorized. So that's kind of floating the system a little bit too.
And just super quick, because I know we're almost running out of time. One of those reforms of 1983 was just undone by Congress in the Social Security Fairness Act. That 1983 reform had said, hey, look, if you worked in a private sector, paid into Social Security during that time, and then you go to work for the government, you still can't claim Social Security benefits. And that was just reversed by Congress. And so now they're draining Social Security even more instead of trying to rein things in a little bit.
Honestly, nothing heats up a conversation and brings engagement more than Social Security, because it literally impacts every individual in this country, right? Mm-hmm. It's like the unifier, because all of us at some point are hoping to have Social Security, right, and have it survive. I spotted this super question that I'm going to wrap up with. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions, but this was submitted ahead of time, and it struck me from Wing Chan in Portland, and I don't know if you're in Maine or in Oregon, but the question is, and we talk a lot about the Fed on Marketplace.
Yes, we do.
Talk a lot about the meetings, and Nancy, you are our Fed reporter, and you go to that presser every time. Question is, does the national debt influence the Fed's decisions on interest rates? Let's go.
Chair Powell has been asked that. He always says, no, we have a dual mandate, which is stable employment and inflation at 2%. But the Treasury Secretary and the Fed chair meet at least once a week, and they talk. And I can't believe that the Fed chair would not sort of help out if Treasury needed to issue a lot of debt and was having problems selling those treasury bonds. So officially, no. Unofficially?
Unofficially, most likely.
Maybe.
I mean,
maybe they work together.
It impacts everything, and you know, maximum employment and inflation. I mean, where do they come from? Right? Where the jobs come from?
Yes.
Where the jobs come from, except from investment, from spending, from government, sometimes from taxes, from all kinds of things. So interconnected. Yes. So you know, they may not be
Treasury and the Fed have to work together to some extent, but the Fed is, you know, jealously guards its independence. So Fed Chair Powell would never admit that.
Kimberly, do you have something to add, Nancy?
Absolutely not. I leave all things Fed to Nancy Marshall-Genzer.
Yeah, that's speaking after Nancy Marshall-Genzer, the Fed guru, of marketplace staff.
Well, thank you everybody for this awesome discussion. And thanks to everyone who's hung out with us here. Sounds like we need more of this. Somebody said we should have one once a week.
Oh my goodness.
I love it. So we will post a link to this for folks who missed the beginning or anything or want to share it, that we will send out to all the investors. Thank you again for all of your support. We also have a survey so you could take and let us know how you thought of this webinar, but also other topics you want to see. So we'll also make sure that gets out to people as well. And you know, like I said, all of your support is so meaningful to us, and it's so important to the work that we do. We get to be able to have these wonderful journalists be able to do their job. And if you're considering upgrading your support, reach out to our team. We'll also send links for that. Otherwise, have a great night, everybody. Thank you again. And thank you to our panelists and to our moderator. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.